New Year's morning, 1945. The Western Front was quiet, the Allies anticipating a few weeks of respite before resuming their relentless push into the heart of Germany. But as the first light crept over Eindhoven, Holland, calm gave way to chaos. Leading aircraftman Desmond Shepherd, groggy from a night of camaraderie and beer, stumbled onto the airfield when the sky seemed to ignite. He recalled, quote, "After breakfast, I was crossing the runway, going toward the armory. At that moment, I heard gunfire. Looking up the runway, I saw what looked like a Me-262 jet streaking above my head. This was closely followed by several FW-19s, and coming in the other direction were several Me-109s. I threw myself down onto the grass at the side of the runway." The peaceful skies over Belgium, the Netherlands and France were torn apart as hundreds of German warplanes descended like a swarm of locusts, raining hell on the Allied airfields below. It was a scene from a nightmare. Allied pilots, their confidence bolstered by months of aerial dominance, stared in disbelief as the Luftwaffe, long thought to be a spent force, launched an audacious attack. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Luftwaffe was crippled, its pilots inexperienced, and its fuel reserves all but dry. But General Lieutenant Werner Kreiper, mastermind of this desperate operation, knew the stakes. It was a gamble of the highest order, a final, frenzied bid to turn the tide. Somehow, against all odds, the Luftwaffe had scraped together over 1,000 aircraft. Fighters and bombers, piloted by greenhorns, were hurled into an implausible assault with one objective: obliterate the RAF and US Army Air Forces on the ground in a single, devastating strike. German pilots roared in low, hugging the earth, the sun at their backs, to confound Allied radar and observers. Their targets were the wings of Spitfires and P-51 Mustangs, lined up like sitting ducks. It was a mission with no return, a final, furious assault, the last ride of the Luftwaffe, and they were determined to make it count. On December 15th, German Major General Dietrich Peltz called the commanders of his 12 Jagdgeschwaders to a clandestine meeting at Jagdkorps 2 headquarters in Altenkirchen. The purpose was to brief them on a daring plan, an all-out surprise assault on Allied airfields. The operation would involve more than 1,300 pilots from 33 groups stationed at 37 air bases. However, the exact date of the attack remained a secret, to be revealed only the night before the operation. Peltz emphasized the need for complete radio silence until the moment of attack, ensuring that the strikes would be simultaneous and catch the Allies off guard. The targets were 21 Allied tactical airfields across northwest Europe, 13 in Belgium, 6 in Holland, and 1 in France. These airfields housed Spitfires, Hawker Tempests and Typhoons, primarily operated by the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force. The squadrons based there included pilots from Norway, Poland, Australia, New Zealand, France and the United States. Peltz distributed aerial photographs of the targets to the commanders, but ordered that these be kept secure until the final briefings. For those unsure of the plan, the instructions were simple. Follow the navigation leader and attack alongside your comrades. Bodenplatte was directly tied to Hitler's last great gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive designed to split the Allied forces and force a second Dunkirk. The air assault was meant to complement the ground offensive, giving the German forces a chance to turn the tide of the war. The very next morning, 24 German divisions launched a surprise attack on what the Americans called the Ghost Front in the Ardennes. Dense fog and rain grounded the Luftwaffe, but the German ground offensive smashed through the thinly held American lines. The initial shock left the Americans reeling, but they quickly rallied and began deploying reserves to counter the German advance. As the weather improved slightly the following day, Peltz ordered his planes into action to support the advancing panzers. However, the Luftwaffe faced heavy losses, 79 aircraft and 55 pilots, due to bad weather and intense anti-aircraft fire. These losses forced Peltz to hold back the remaining planes, reserving them for the much-anticipated Grosse Schlag, the Big Punch operation. In the days that followed, the German offensive began to falter. American forces, including the 82nd Airborne and 7th Armored Divisions, successfully blocked key roads at St. Vith, while the 101st Airborne fiercely defended Bastogne and its critical road junctions. German supply lines, reliant on horse-drawn wagons, struggled to keep up with the advancing panzers, and many Nazi units ran out of fuel. By December 23rd, the weather cleared over the Ardennes, allowing American and British tactical aircraft to launch devastating attacks on German armored columns. Heavy bombers from the US 8th Air Force targeted rail junctions west of the Rhine, further crippling German logistics. Peltz was forced to commit his fighters to defend these vital supply routes, but lost 98 more planes and 63 pilots in the process. The lack of unlimited visibility, which was crucial for the success of Operation Bodenplatte, continued to frustrate Peltz and his planners. Christmas Eve saw the US 8th Air Force launch its largest mission of the war against Luftwaffe bases on the Western Front, with 2,034 bombers escorted by 700 fighters. British Spitfires, Tempests and Typhoons followed suit, attacking ground targets in the Ardennes. Peltz lost 106 aircraft and 85 pilots in a single day. The relentless Allied assaults continued on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, with the Luftwaffe losing another 122 planes and 98 pilots. On the ground, the situation was equally dire. American and British tanks launched a counterattack at the tip of the bulge at Celle, decimating the 2nd Panzer Division within sight of the Meuse River. By Boxing Day, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's U.S. Third Army had linked up with the besieged forces in Bastogne, effectively breaking the German siege. Despite these setbacks, the plan for Bodenplatte remained on the table. On December 27th, as bad weather grounded much of the US 8th Air Force in England, the RAF's Typhoons and Spitfires continued to hammer German troop concentrations in the Ardennes. Peltz suffered further losses, 50 more planes and 36 pilots. Undeterred, Hitler ordered a second offensive in Alsace for New Year's Day, demanding air support from Göring. Göring was thrilled. As soon as the weather cleared, Operation Bodenplatte would be unleashed. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots were seething with frustration. The directive from Jagdkorps 2 made no sense. All New Year's Eve parties were cancelled. For these men, who fought fiercely in the skies, the idea of being denied their year-end celebration seemed absurd. Whether they were seasoned veterans like Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Pips Priller or fresh-faced rookies, the pilots were used to balancing intense combat with equally intense partying. Among them were aces like Oberstleutnant Herbert Ehlefeld, who had been racking up victories since the Spanish Civil War, and Major Erich Leyer, who boasted 118 victories. These men had been through the worst, and if anyone deserved to blow off steam on New Year's Eve, it was them. But 1944 had been a brutal year. Unlike their British and American counterparts, who were rotated out of combat after a certain number of missions, the Luftwaffe pilots remained at the front, flying mission after mission until they were either wounded, incapacitated, or given their lives for the fatherland. By the end of the year, many of Germany's best pilots had been lost and replaced by undertrained and terrified rookies. The Jagdgeschwaders, or fighter wings, once formidable units, were now shadows of their former selves, with numbers dwindling from over 100 fighters to as few as 50. These pilots faced overwhelming odds daily as they battled the relentless waves of Allied bombers and fighters. Morale was low and the situation was dire. Hitler's determination to fight on meant that the Luftwaffe had to keep flying despite the near certainty of defeat. Mi 262 jet fighters offered a glimmer of hope, but they were too few and too late to change the tide of the war. For these exhausted pilots, a night of drinking and camaraderie would have been a welcome reprieve from the relentless pressure. However, Dietrich Peltz, the commander of JK2, had other plans. He had forbidden the usual New Year's Eve celebrations, leaving pilots like Lieutenant Oscar Busch, who had to cancel a date, and the men of JG2, who found their bar closed, fuming. There was no time for parties at Babenhausen Airfield, where the pilots of JG4 were still repairing their bombed-out airstrip. By noon on New Year's Eve, the airstrip was ready for Captain Georg Schroeder's Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, but the reason for the cancellations remained a mystery. The Luftwaffe needed clear skies and unlimited visibility for a bold counterattack against the Allies, and the weather forecasters had promised just that for New Year's Day. The plan, known as Operation Bodenplatte, was a massive surprise assault on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. The goal was to destroy the Royal Air Force and US Army air forces on the ground, crippling the Allies' air power in one swift blow. Germany's ideal outcome for Operation Bodenplatte hinged on a meticulously coordinated surprise attack designed to cripple Allied air superiority. The plan called for Luftwaffe pilots to fly at treetop level in a formation designed to stay beneath the radar and out of sight from Allied ground observers. Timing and secrecy were paramount. The attack was set to take place at dawn, when the first light would give the German pilots just enough visibility without alerting the Allies. Approaching from upsun, the German fighters aimed to unleash a devastating barrage of strafing fire on Allied airfields, where rows of Supermarine Spitfires and P-51 Mustangs would be parked, vulnerable and unprepared. The goal was to destroy these aircraft on the ground before they could take off, effectively eliminating the Allies' ability to challenge German air dominance. With the Allied fighters neutralized, the Luftwaffe would regain control of the skies over the battlefield. This aerial dominance was critical as it would allow German bombers, including the cutting-edge Arado 234 jets, to strike with impunity. These bombers were tasked with targeting Allied ground forces, supply columns, and additional air bases, aiming to cripple the Allies' tactical support and weaken their ground operations. As the pilots braced for the coming assault, they knew that this operation was their last chance to strike a significant blow against the Allies. Operation Bodenplatte would be their final, desperate gamble to regain control over Western Europe's skies. On New Year's morning, 1945, the Allied pilots in Northwest Europe were more likely to expect a fog of hangovers than a sky full of Nazi aircraft. Since the Normandy invasion, the Luftwaffe had been driven to the ground, barely a threat in the skies. The harsh December weather had grounded much of the Allied Air Force during the Ardennes offensive, but as the new year dawned, cold and clear, the only thing keeping the Allies from launching a renewed aerial assault was the remnants of last night's celebrations. But the Luftwaffe had other plans. Leading aircraftsman Desmond Shepherd recalled, quote, "The first hours of 1945 were spent letting in the new year, wishing each other all the best and having a few beers. After breakfast, I was crossing the runway toward the armory when the distant rattle of gunfire caught my ear. I looked up just in time to see a Mi-262 jet scream over my head, followed closely by a swarm of FW-19s. Moments later, Mi-109s appeared, diving straight at the airfield. I threw myself down onto the grass as bullets tore through the air. At Airfield, Belgium, Sergeant Peter Kraust, an RAF air controller, reported for duty at 9 a.m. He recalled, quote, "We were still nursing our hangovers from the night before when the roar of engines shattered the calm. A squadron of low-flying fighters was heading straight for us. My CO asked if we were expecting Spitfires, but when I looked closer, I saw they were Focke-Wulf 190s. Moments later, I was flat on the ground, gripping the earth as the attack began. At Knokke, Belgium, as German fighters strafed the airfield, Skundersleider G. Dickinson urgently called headquarters. Quote, "This is January 1st, old boy, not April 1st, was the response he got. But then came a chilling realization on the other end when he heard, quote, 'My God, the bastards are here.' The line went silent. Reports of attacks were flooding in from across northwest Europe, and it was clear the Luftwaffe had launched a massive, coordinated assault. The first wave of German fighters hit Belgium just after 8 a.m. An Allied Oster pilot on an artillery spotting mission frantically radioed in, quote, 'Just past formation of at least 200 Messerschmitts, flying low on course 320. The Luftwaffe had arrived in force. At Brussels-Evere Airfield, the initial moments of the attack were chaotic. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson, Britain's top ace, heard the engines approaching and dismissed them as another American formation. But as the first German fighters dove in, strafing the tarmac, the airmen were jolted into action. Someone shouted, quote, "They're bloody Focke-Wulfs," sending everyone scrambling for the anti-aircraft guns. The German planes swooped in with accuracy. At Grimbergen, IJG-26 and the 3 JG-54 found the airfield nearly empty. Just a few B-17s and a lone P-51. Furious at the lack of targets, Major Karl Boris of IJG-26 ordered his pilots to strafe everything in sight, tearing into the parked planes and vehicles. But not everything went the Luftwaffe's way. Over Eindhoven, JG-3 met fierce resistance. Flight Lieutenant Gibby Gibbons took off in his Typhoon and quickly found himself in the sights of a Mi-109. With a sharp maneuver, Gibbons outflanked his attacker, shooting down the German fighter, only to be struck down himself moments later by another enemy plane. The airfield turned into a battleground, with dogfights raging just feet above the ground. Pilots who had been preparing for takeoff were forced to abandon their planes, diving for cover as bullets raked the runways. Further north, at Antwerp-Deurne, the chaos was just as intense. JG-77's attack was marred by friendly fire. German anti-aircraft units near Rotterdam mistook their planes for Allied fighters and opened fire. Despite this, the German pilots pressed on, their FW-190s screaming in low over the snow-covered landscape, determined to inflict maximum damage. At Brussels-Grimbergen, the defenders responded with ferocity. Group Captain Alexander Gabzowicz and his adjutant, barely having time for breakfast, rushed to the airfield to coordinate the defense. As the German fighters descended, anti-aircraft guns erupted, filling the sky with flak. JG-54's Feldwebel Gunther Egli was among the first casualties, his FW-190 spiraling out of control into the ground. Meanwhile, at St. Denis Westrom, the Poles of 131 Wing scrambled to meet the attackers. Flight Sergeant Joseph Stanowski, low on fuel but high on determination, engaged the enemy with reckless courage. In a daring maneuver, he forced a German pilot to panic and drop his landing gear, slowing the plane just enough for Stanowski to deliver a fatal burst of machine gun fire. The German fighter crashed in flames into the town below. As the battle raged, the Luftwaffe formations began to falter. Miscommunication, friendly fire, and fierce anti-aircraft defenses were taking a toll. Many of the German planes, having completed their strafing runs, struggled to regroup. The journey back to their bases proved just as dangerous as the attack, with Allied fighters and flak batteries hunting them down. By the time the sun set, both sides felt the outcome of the operation. The Allies, though hit hard, quickly recovered. Their logistics kicked into high gear, repairing damaged planes and replacing losses within days. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, had just put the final nail on its own coffin. Operation Bodenplatte, intended to turn the tide, instead marked the final desperate gasp of Nazi air power, a futile effort that only hastened the Third Reich's collapse. In the immediate aftermath, the Luftwaffe's losses were staggering. Over 300 aircraft were destroyed, and more than 150 pilots were lost or went missing, including many of the Luftwaffe's most experienced veterans. Among the losses were 2 Jagdgeschwader JG commanders, 14 Gruppe commanders, and 64 squadron leaders, the backbone of Germany's fighter command. The operational failure was compounded by the fact that many of these losses were caused by friendly fire from German anti-aircraft batteries, highlighting the disarray within the German military. The material losses for the Allies were significant, with around 300 aircraft destroyed on the ground and 70 more in aerial combat. However, the impact on Allied operational capability was minimal. The efficient Allied logistics network quickly replaced lost aircraft, and airfields were repaired within days. In contrast, the Luftwaffe's losses were irreplaceable. With fuel shortages, a lack of experienced pilots, and dwindling resources, the Luftwaffe was effectively crippled as a fighting force on the Western Front. The legacy of Operation Bodenplatte was one of futility and desperation. The operation, meant to be a decisive blow to Allied air power, instead underscored the Luftwaffe's declining capabilities. It was a final, desperate gamble that failed to achieve its objectives and hastened the Luftwaffe's demise. The operation also revealed the growing disintegration of German military cohesion, as evidenced by the friendly fire incidents and the disorganization during the attack. Strategically, Bodenplatte had no lasting impact on the course of the war. The Allies quickly resumed their air superiority, and the German retreat from the Battle of the Bulge continued unabated. By mid-January, the Luftwaffe was no longer a significant threat to Allied operations in Western Europe. In the broader context of the war, Operation Bodenplatte is remembered as a poignant symbol of Nazi Germany's final, futile efforts to turn the tide of a conflict that had already been irrevocably lost. The operation's failure marked the end of the Luftwaffe as an effective force and foreshadowed the impending collapse of the Third Reich.